I'm Micah and Knapp.
And I'm Jake Knapp.
Welcome to Exodus Brothers, where we're going to explore our journey from growing up in evangelical Christianity to deconstructing those beliefs and finding healing.
In this three-part series, we'll share our experiences of navigating a tightly controlled setting, the challenges of questioning and stepping away from its teachings, and how we've worked to rebuild our lives.
This podcast is about more than just our story. It's a discussion on faith, identity, and liberation from our past. Join us as we uncover the layers of our experiences and search for what lies ahead.
Before we begin, we want to clarify that this podcast isn't about assigning blame or debating the existence of God. Our goal is to share our personal experiences growing up in religion and how we've processed and healed from the traumas we've endured.
We deeply love and respect our parents, and we understand they did what they believed was best. This is about our journey, our struggles, and the steps we've taken to find peace and understanding in our lives.
That said, we recognize that some of what we share might be difficult, off-putting, or even offensive to some listeners. It's not our intention to hurt or offend anyone, but we believe it's important to speak openly and honestly about our experiences.
So we're going to start this off by kind of going back in time a bit and starting at the beginning. We're going to discuss how our parents first met. So going back in time a little bit, in the early 70s, our mom was diagnosed with a rare form of cancer called fibrosarcoma. And basically, she was told by the doctors that she wasn't going to live, and it was essentially a death sentence. And she didn't know how to take that at the time. It was obviously very overwhelming, especially for a 14-year-old to be told that. And she kind of turned to religion at that point as a way to cope with that. And she was invited by a dear friend of hers to go to a big healing seminar that was taking place in Bellingham, Washington at the time. And there was a group coming that was called the Happy Hunters. The Happy Hunters were a couple that basically claimed that they could heal people through the power of God. And this was their mission, going across the country and holding these prayer seminars. So my mom thought, what the heck? She'd go check it out. And she went, and it was this big event with hundreds of people. And, they gave their speeches, and at the end they called people up to be prayed over. And each person had a different thing they wanted to pray about for themselves. For my mom, obviously, she wanted to be prayed over for her cancer and to be healed. So she went up to the stage at the end of the seminar, and they put their hands on her and they prayed over her, and basically she said she ended up passing out, and that she woke up with a sense of joy and completeness and happiness and just felt completely fulfilled. After this seminar, she had a surgery done, and apparently the cancer went into almost complete remission after that. And she attributed that to being prayed over by the Happy Hunters. And so this was a light bulb moment for her, where she thought, God has saved me, and he's looking after me. This is a miracle. And I've got to, now that I have, the cancer went away essentially, and she felt like she had her whole life in front of her now to do whatever she wanted. According to her, she kind of forged a personal relationship with God. And this was something that she felt like was life-changing. And she felt like she wanted to go into the world and become a missionary for Jesus and spread the word and become a missionary, which is essentially how our parents first met. My mom started attending in a church called Assemblies of God at the time. And there she met our father, and they ended up getting married. And both of them had felt a bit lost in life. My mom felt like she didn't really have a very good father figure in her life, and she turned to God for that. Yeah, our father felt like he couldn't find anything fulfilling in his life that really was driving him. He tried a few different things and avenues, and they all seemed to lead to dead ends, and he felt like he couldn't really connect to anybody. So he turned to religion as well, and started, he kind of fell into actually becoming a youth pastor at a local church and running that. And this happened to be at Assemblies of God, where he met our mother as well. And through church, through religion, they felt like they had the same shared passion and goal, which was to go out to the world and spread the message of God. So, or as my dad called it, he wanted to be he was a hot to go radical for Jesus. So they joined a few ministries, the first of which was called Last Days Ministries. which was located in Lindale, Texas, back in 1983.
Yeah, and just to expand upon that, Last Days Ministries is a Christian organization founded by musician Keith Green. Their ministry basically focused on spreading the gospel through publications, music, media, with an overall message emphasizing the urgency that they were living in the final days before Christ's return. They promoted a radical devotion to Christ and a lifestyle that was sort of separate from worldly values, as well as being actively involved in the pro-life movement.
A lot of people that were joining up to be a part of Last Days were actually selling their homes and quitting their jobs and completely transitioning their lives over to Last Days to live on the compound there, which included our parents, who also sold their home to move there.
They moved to Last Days when I was a baby, maybe 6 months old. And obviously I was too young to remember that experience, but that early move definitely played a significant role in shaping the influence of religion in our lives.
There's a lot of people who afterwards came out and talked about their cult-like tendencies there, and I know that our father said that it was very controlling, and the structure was a bit abusive. They made them feel like they were sort of cogs in a wheel, as how he referred to it, and they felt like part of this machine, and that when they said that they were thinking about leaving, they stopped talking to them altogether and just basically cut them off at that point, which was happening to a lot of people that were going there.
Yeah, being kind of ostracized once you're no longer part of that insular community. You're sort of shunned or ostracized or seen as an outsider at that point.
Right, like you can't question anything. You can't question the authority. The buck stops there, basically, and then you're shunned at that point. It left our parents feeling, especially our dad, feeling very disillusioned after that, because this was kind of their first big ministry that they were excited before this. They were energized, and it was this sort of Jesus movement that had been happening from the 70s to 80s, and that they were a part of, and there was a lot of fervor and excitement, and to go kind of leave everything behind to go join this mission, and then suddenly it kind of just backfires and is not what they're hoping it would be, and it's obviously abusive, and it's very controlling, and there's a lot of people who share the same feelings, and to leave that, to have basically to have sold your home and moved away, and then to come back and you have nothing suddenly. What do you do?
After Last Days Ministries, we moved back to, I believe for a period we lived in Ferndale, which is just outside of Bellingham. And it was while we were living there that I had kind of a pretty traumatic event unfold on my 4th birthday, which also happened to fall on Mother's Day that year. May 10, 1987, I was run over by a car driven by my uncle. I nearly died, and I spent 3 weeks in the hospital. There's something called childhood amnesia. So a lot of people don't really recall memories prior to being about 3 or 4 years old. And so just having that happen, having a traumatic event like that happen right when my brain was beginning to form long-term memories, I feel like that trauma really imprinted pretty deeply. And at the time that happened, I think my father was unemployed, for one. But also, my parents believed that the accident was a result of spiritual warfare, partly due to their involvement in the pro-life movement. And meanwhile, my uncle, he coped sort of through denial, refusing to accept or acknowledge his role in the accident. And so that avoidance sort of prevented us from discussing the accident and left a lot of unprocessed trauma. And it took 37 years before we eventually had that conversation and were able to kind of reconcile and talk about what happened. And I feel like, it would have been a much better situation had we been able to talk about it instead of it kind of became this weird taboo topic of conversation where we couldn't bring it up, couldn't acknowledge what happened. And so that was pretty traumatic, and that definitely affected me in a lot of ways. Obviously, some post-traumatic stress and anxiety, and even just being in the hospital and not knowing why the doctors are having to do what they're doing, to save my life. So that was a pretty traumatic thing, and we basically went from that happening, and maybe a month later we moved once again to Montana. We moved to Lakeside, Montana, and at that time we had a family of 6. There's 4 boys now, so we have 2 other brothers. And my father had taken a staff position with YWAM, which stands for Youth with a Mission, which is a global Christian missions organization with a strong focus on evangelism and missionary work. And they could sort of be seen as like a sister group to Last Days Ministries. In fact, I think YWAM and Last Days Ministries were actually worked together on some levels and were sort of loosely intertwined. But we lived on this old Air Force base in Lakeside, Montana, right near Kalispell. And it housed maybe 200 people. And so my early formative years were spent in this very insular Christian community, or what some people might call a Bible bubble. Not to disparage our parents, but they were pretty strict. All our entertainment had to be Christian-based. We didn't have television aside from, watching the occasional movie or something like that. No video games. And so, I, being 4, 5, 6 years old, I had friends who were having fun watching shows like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and I wasn't permitted to. One Christmas, we received a Nintendo from our grandparents, and we were thrilled. But our parents disapproved, and so we never got to keep it, which was pretty disappointing.
What you're getting at is essentially that there was permitted items and things, certain magazines we could only read, and no entertainment, no movies, basically. So you're just kind of being fed what they want to their diet, their prescription, right?
Yeah, so we were obviously living on a YWAM base. Obviously, in that setting, we were pretty deeply immersed in Christian teachings, and I remember things like being rewarded for memorizing the names of all the books of the Bible when I was maybe 6, and I could recite them in the form of a song. And I was also part of a kids group. It was called Straight Arrows, and we would earn little pins for memorizing Bible verses and stuff like that. Our social interactions were also pretty limited to a few friends on the base, and our exposure to different people and experiences was therefore pretty restricted. Our mom served as our teacher, so we also sort of missed out on the typical early school experience.
And that's something to mention too, is that the homeschooling, that was a big part of the sort of conservative movement at the time, conservative Christian movement was to homeschool your kids, so you could, the information they're getting is, pretty much religious based information. It's the creationism as opposed to evolution and things like that. You're getting, they're basically the homeschool information is all, things based around Christianity as opposed to science and history and things like that.
It's also the 80s where you have things like satanic panic and that kind of thing going on. And so, our parents did their best to sort of protect us within this bubble that we lived in. But as we later would discover, it was also within this bubble that a lot of trauma occurred.
Absolutely. And I remember our dad talking about how at YWAM, at Lakeside, they made him take a personality test. I think it was required. It was the Myers-Briggs or something like the Myers-Briggs personality test. And he got the results back, and they basically were like, you're the most rare form. We don't know how to deal with you. And they kind of just, again, made him feel ostracized and like he was, kind of this outsider. That made him kind of feel like he didn't fit in, which is obviously this recurring theme that had started to build from Last Days to YWAM. Just kind of, they had to pay to be on the base. So they're paying to be there. I think our dad was only making $600 a month from outside sources. I think through some of the pro-life slideshows he was doing at the time and other ministry work. So they're having to pay to be there, and then working for free on this compound. Again, moving away from, you're cut off from family. There's no internet back then, so you've moved away from your hometown. Again, you're cut off and isolated, and then if people are treating you in a way that makes you feel like you don't fit in, it's even more isolating.
Right, exactly. And that's the way that YWAM operates, is that nobody that is involved on staff or in YWAM is paid. And so he was, like you said, he was supporting a family of 6 on $600 a month, which even in those days was not a lot. We stayed on the YWAM base for about 3 years roughly, but eventually, again, our parents felt it wasn't the best fit because of how they were treated and sort of seen as outsiders a bit. So we moved back to Bellingham. Back in Bellingham, we started attending a local church. And it was there around the age of 8 that I experienced another distressing event. I was molested by the female youth group leader. And that obviously left me feeling extremely anxious and confused. It was an experience I couldn't fully understand at the time, and I didn't even tell anyone until I was probably in my mid-20s. And so for years, I carried this deep sense of shame and confusion, and I often wondered if it was something that I had done wrong. It took a long time to understand that what happened wasn't my fault. That experience was one of the many things that later led me to question the environment I grew up in, which was an environment that preached safety and trust, but in my case didn't provide either. So that was another difficult thing. Again, being a shy kid, I'd had a traumatic car accident, which wasn't able to be discussed. And then we've done a lot of moving around, trying to find where we fit in. And I'm a shy, quiet kid that then goes through this experience from a leader who I was supposed to look up to and trust. And I didn't know what to do with that information. I didn't feel safe, or for whatever reason, I didn't tell anybody about it. So I just sort of stuffed it down. And that's just adding to more internal trauma that's going on in my life. I just internalized it, and it wouldn't really sort of rear its head until later years, and when I actually dealt with it.
And wouldn't you say that's something that kind of these evangelical Christian places kind of breed, this kind of mentality that you're supposed to be obedient, submissive, don't question authority? So it kind of leads to these kind of situations like you experienced.
Right, exactly. Yeah, you're not to ever question authority. You take their word for it. It felt like it was because of something I had done wrong, and it must be my fault, right? So this is almost like a form of self-gaslighting. I remember discussing it with our parents, and so our parents reached out to her and basically inquired, wanted to know if this happened and if this was true, and she didn't deny it. She acknowledged it, and she said that she had done this to other boys. But of course, nobody ever thinks that's going to happen. They think this is a good environment, and this is the environment that's going to protect my kids. But obviously, in this case, it wasn't.
So like the blind obedience to God that people are supposed to have, it's the same thing to their leaders and the authority figures in the church. Or almost like the Catholic priests that molest children and then get moved from one parish to another instead of facing any sort of legal repercussions at all.
You even see in some situations, you see leaders are shuffled around, and sometimes they blame the victim, where they say, this person was acting like a Jezebel spirit. They were tempting them, or they were dressing provocatively. So it's their fault that they were molested by somebody.
Right. It's always shifting blame onto the victim as opposed to the perpetrator. It's also a domino effect of some people, obviously, that are abused, then abuse other people, unfortunately.
I think naturally I'm a person that has a lot of a strong sense of justice, and I want people to be held accountable for their actions.
Yeah, absolutely. And as a kid, also, you want to be protected by adults. And I'm sure that it makes you feel like you don't know who you can trust and what environments are safe.
And it's sort of the compounding effect of all of these things, right? So you're in an environment that is very insular and small, and then you have these fairly rigid belief system, and then you have these traumas that are sort of unfolding and not discussing them, not working through them, sort of sweeping things on the rug. We just don't acknowledge that. We don't talk about even just talk therapy can be very powerful.
And that's exactly why we're making this podcast.
Yes,
is that we're trying to show that you can speak out about things that are, seen as stigmas or things that you shouldn't talk about, but we want to make sure that we can break down those barriers and keep talking about things that are hard maybe, but that are important to work through. Essentially, at this point, our family has gone from trauma to trauma to trauma and jumping around and moving from what I would call cult-like organizations, one to another. And upon coming back, our family was actually living with our grandparents in a small home, and my parents were living in an unheated garage of theirs. And all of us four brothers, Jake and I, and the two others, were living in one small room in bunk beds together because our parents didn't have any money after leaving YWAM because they were living off of nothing there and not being paid anything. So they were just in a dark period of time where, and especially our dad just didn't know, felt lost and felt like he was doing God's calling, but it wasn't going anywhere, and just felt disillusioned by it all and didn't know what the next steps were. So we stayed with them for a while, which is kind of where my memories begin. And I feel like it was actually a nice place to be in a way, because I remember it being a bit more stable at the time. living with our grandparents, and we could actually watch television for the first time. We were watching movies for the first time. Just a bit more exposure to kind of the real world, which was, as Jake said, called, was seen as the secular world, and it was like this scary outside world, where bad things happened, and the bubble you were in was the safe place that was the right place to be and the right side, God's holy war and all that. I also remember right around that time period, maybe a little bit after, because our parents were involved in the pro-life movement. I remember as a little kid, I have a memory of standing outside of Planned Parenthood. We were part of a anti-abortion protest, and I remember holding a sign in my hands. I had no idea what it meant or what it referred to. I had no comprehension about what the subject material was. I just remember there were people driving by in cars, and women, mostly predominantly women, leaning out their windows and screaming at us, F you, our body, our choice. And I just remember being screamed at as a kid. I had no idea what was going on. It was very confusing and chaotic. I felt a bit like I was a bit of a puppet being used as a pawn, and it just wasn't a good feeling, and just a memory in a series of memories of just kind of feeling that way.
Yeah, that's intense. At an early age, and you have no critical thinking skills, that belief system or those beliefs become ingrained with your very identity. And so that at a certain time, later on in your life, as you get older, anytime anybody challenges those beliefs or those ideas, it feels like you're being attacked personally. Your personal identity is being attacked.
Exactly. The Vineyard movement that our parents got involved with talked a lot about the gifts of the Spirit, which was all these gifts that you were supposedly given by God, and that could be like prophecy. It could be all sorts of different things in that vein. And being slain in the Spirit was kind of like you'd feel the Holy Spirit come over you during prayer, and you'd pass out maybe or fall over. There was also laying on of the hands, which was where people would pray for you and touch you, and people would speak in tongues, and just kind of, you were kind of just, you almost felt like, or people felt like the Holy Spirit was working through you. And so it was just kind of like letting the Holy Spirit take over your body, and people spasming and falling over. So as Jake was mentioning, very charismatic. And it was more showy, more of almost like a circus, like a stage performance. And so that's kind of what we got involved with. And one of the early Vineyard churches we started attending when I was about 6 or 7 years old is that we attended a church just across the border. We were living in Bellingham, Washington, which is 2 hours north of Seattle, Washington. And then just across the border, there was a church we were going to. And there I had an experience that is very vivid in my memory, which is when I was about, as I said, 7 years old. I was called upon one morning to be the recipient of that day's prayer session. So I remember it was just very kind of foreboding and creepy. I remember being called upon. I remember walking up the aisle up to the stage where there was a group of members of the church there waiting for me that had formed a circle. And basically I walked into the circle, and they closed the circle around me. And I remember feeling extremely claustrophobic. It was very strange and unusual. I didn't know what was going on. And all these strangers are putting their hands on me. I remember getting really hot. I started sweating. Everyone was sweating around me, and people are speaking in tongues. People are trying to tell me to say certain things. They're asking me, inquiring how I'm feeling. I remember saying, "Oh, I feel very hot," because I was. And they, interpreted that, of course, as, "Oh, that's the Holy Spirit. He's working through you, and let your tongue loose." And again, people are kind of waving their hands, in the air, and their eyes are wild and with this fervor, and just very intense. And it was just scary to me as a kid because I didn't have any way of understanding it. I didn't have a language to express it or cope with it. It wasn't by any means bad per se. It was just unusual and a little creepy and confusing, I think, and just that feeling of claustrophobia. But mainly, I just didn't really like strangers or people touching me or putting their hands on me. I didn't like people invading my bubble like that, so I didn't feel good. So it was just kind of an experience where you want to turn to your parents, but you don't really have this is something they're a part of. So they're obviously at that point supportive of it. And maybe in retrospect, they, think differently of it now. But for me as a little kid, it was just kind of an overwhelming experience. I kind of tie my anxiety that I have dealt with my whole life kind of to these early experiences, because when you're living a life that feels very chaotic and unsure, you don't know what's next. You don't know who you're going to be around. It feels, your life feels unstable and chaotic. So it causes anxiety. And I feel like for myself, a lot of it stems from these early memories.
Yeah, agreed. There was a time period in my life where I think my coping mechanism was laughter, was humor. And so I would make light of certain situations by just poking fun at things, making fun of people. So on the outside, I seemed like a bubbly, happy-go-lucky, prankster, jokester, whatever. But really, that was, looking back at that now, I can see that was just a coping mechanism. Because I couldn't talk about it, I had to joke about it. And so that was like my odd coping mechanism. So I think for a while it worked. I think there was a time period in my life where that strategy worked for me. Getting older and developing good critical thinking skills, I realized that there's all this unresolved trauma. There's all this stuff I haven't talked about, I haven't dealt with, and it's still there. And if I don't do something about it, it's only going to get worse, and it's only going to come to the surface, and it's only going to present itself in all these extreme ways, such as having panic attacks. So I knew that I had to do something about it, and eventually I did. I was able to get I did some cognitive behavioral therapy, some mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, and I found some ways of dealing with these things, and obviously talking about it. Just simply sitting down like we're doing now and having a conversation about it is I think, very important.
That's the beauty of this, these kind of podcasts, is hopefully it's healing for you and for us, and then also for other people who maybe have experienced similar things and can connect, or feel like, hey, I'm not alone. These other people have experienced the same thing, and now it makes more sense for me too. And I think we all have our coping mechanisms, and at least humor is a healthy one, at least, and at least it makes others laugh as well. For me, it was escapism into imaginary worlds and movies and cinema and movie making, which was my passion growing up. And I'm actually working on a documentary that's actually about this topic that we're talking about, called Kid with the Movie Camera. And it's a documentary that will explore some of these stories and themes as well.
Obviously, for myself, I was homeschooled through 7th grade. So starting at 8th grade, I attended a small private Christian school with about 60 students from middle school through high school. So even though that was a small school, transitioning from homeschooled, where you have you and your 3 brothers, that was still a fairly significant transition. And you had a lot of students that went to Christian school. You think it's all, kids from Christian families and stuff, and for the most part it is. But you also have a lot of students that are there because their parents hoped that the Christian environment would address behavioral issues. So the dynamics were really similar to those of a public school, just on a smaller scale, because you still had students that exhibited typical behaviors for their age, such as, like, when you get into high school, you experiment, a lot of kids do, with alcohol, marijuana, and partying on the weekends. So even despite that Christian setting, these activities were common among a lot of the students, including myself. Eventually, I went through a phase where, 16 years old, tried smoking marijuana, had some parties on the weekend, did that. Not that I went down that route, really, but certainly I experimented with it. And a lot of the Christian kids that went to that school were not inherently different from kids that went to public school.
Yeah, the big thing I'll note is that, and we had a similar experience too with that, but one thing is that I think the sex education is pretty abysmal in the Christian schools, and that they have some of the highest rates of teen pregnancy, and their form of sex education is basically don't have sex, abstinence, which statistically is not a good thing. But yeah, I almost felt like that some of the kids in the Christian school almost were, and maybe this is just my view, maybe it's not the statistics on it, but I feel like they were more repressed because of the way they grew up, and so they were more likely to act out in an unhealthy way, and typically later in life, and in bigger, harsher ways, as opposed to people who kind of get out of their system early on, or they have parents they can kind of talk about it with, or families that they're able to, not as strict environments that they're growing up in. But my experience was pretty similar. I actually didn't go to in-person school, elementary school, till 3rd grade. So imagine being homeschooled all the way to 3rd grade. Most kids have all that time to kind of like very, very important formative years of learning how to work with other kids and being in environments away from your family, from, pre-K, kindergarten, all those things that I missed out on. So for me, my social anxiety just spiked because I go from, me and my brothers basically to all these random strangers and not having my parents around. I had panic attacks over that because it was a huge jump. There's just so much information you're missing, having been fed, just the Christian magazines and the Christian music and the Christian movies, and you're missing out on everything else that everyone else in the world is aware of. I mean, even kindergarten, there's a lot of little things you're learning. That's the point of it. Even though you're just playing or whatever. But anyways, I went from private Christian school in 3rd grade. Then I was taken out of that in 5th grade, and I was homeschooled again. And then I went to an online school, and then I was in another private Christian school, and then finally public school. And I feel like the jumping around really threw me off, and I was always playing catch up. And by the time I got to high school, I had started sophomore year, 2nd semester. So everyone had made friends already. So I was the new kid, but also I didn't have any friends there. I was out of the loop. Everyone already had friends. So I was like walking around the school in this sort of lonely, solitary state, not knowing how to jump into a social group, and also being in public school suddenly. Ultimately, I think by the end of it, it was good for me because I think I actually adapted more because of it, just being out in sort of the real world. And even though it was hard, I actually think it was beneficial personally. But I feel like I'm still, I've gotten pretty good, and people are still surprised when they meet me and I say I was homeschooled, but there's a part of me with the social anxiety that's still there that I still have to deal with. That stems from sort of that form of education that we had. I think all along our dad was always thinking that eventually he'd be a leader and a pastor of a church, and it was just a matter of time. And after the church in Canada went kind of south, and our parents kind of caught on to its bizarre antics, and they were not a fan either, and they agreed. And I think they later apologized to me, at least, for attending that church. Our parents got involved, and the vineyard was started by John Wimber. And at this point, the vineyard's focus was very much on church planting across the country. And so there were vineyard churches popping up all over. And so our parents started their own vineyard church. And the beginning of this was actually in our own home. Our first church services were held in our house, much to the chagrin of the neighbors who thought we were a bunch of weirdos, a bunch of Jesus freaks. They were like looking through their blinds and windows at us and seeing the cars pile up on the sidewalk. And it was a lot of like old friends and family members and people that our parents peeled away from their churches / they were really focused on college students of that age. So it was just a handful of people, but I remember our living room being lined with these metal chairs in rows. Yeah, so eventually, obviously the church grew in numbers. We had to it was inevitable, we had to find a space for the church. So my dad came across a space. It was a shared art space downtown that was shared with an old independent movie theater. And it was in the back of the building there. And I remember it was pretty funny because people that walked into the building had to walk past a row of independent movie posters, which to a lot of these like churchy people was too much. And it was like some scary or like secular looking movie posters. So they were freaked out. Some people even left when they saw those.
I think Dad even used that as like a barrier for entry. Like if they can't get past the hallway and seeing these certain posters, then they probably aren't going to be a good fit.
Well, I feel like the vineyard and these charismatic churches were over the top and too much. I think our parents' approach was more about reaching out and helping people and outreach and making a difference in the community, which I think their approach was really good.
Yeah, their intentions were very heartfelt. I definitely can respect them for that. Absolutely.
The difficult part for me was that the church was always warning about the dangers of the outside secular world and, child molesters and rapists and mentally unstable people. And we oftentimes would welcome those kind of people into our home and in our inner circle. And the church, especially being downtown, there was a lot of homeless population. And we had quite a few mentally ill people that started coming. And one lady in particular that I think we deemed her Crazy Mary was the name we used for her.
Indeed.
And she was someone who was actually notorious for stalking youth pastors in the church. She was like a groupie for church leaders. And I don't think my parents knew that at the time, but she was looking for housing. And actually our parents ended up inviting her to live with us for a short time. I think it was just a few weeks, but she ended up babysitting us even. And again, kind of this environment where were talking about trying to keep us safe from the outside dangers, but we're letting them into our very home and they're watching us. She was very mentally ill. I remember we made a lot of movies growing up, and I remember she was complaining that we're making satanic films and that we needed to be punished for making these. And she went to her parents and was trying to reprimand us.
What she didn't know is that later we would go on to make a movie called Fantastic Stan Goes to Hell. So that probably would have really thrown her for a loop.
There's a lot of people who wanted the church to go different directions. They didn't think our dad was conservative enough, or not. He didn't push too hard into the very showiness of it, or he wasn't, or he was too much. And so he always felt like he was being criticized by all sides.
That's sort of the issue you have just within the umbrella of Christianity. Obviously, you have so many. I mean, there's over 40,000 denominations now. There's over 200 denominations, Christian denominations in the United States alone. And so everybody kind of has their own ideas of how to interpret the Bible. Is it prescriptive, descriptive, allegory, literal? And so you have so many different denominations and groups that all see it differently, and they all think that their version is the correct version. And so it's pretty hard to get anybody in any group to sort of align on one sort of direction or one idea. And so even within our small group of, our small church of 100 people, you had a lot of people that wanted it to be less rocky, or different kinds of approaches for sermons or whatever. Everybody had their own idea of how it should be run.
I also remember just feeling like the pressure to be pastor's kids was difficult, or a pastor's kid, I'll speak for myself, was difficult because there was kind of, you're in the spotlight, you're the pressure to be kind of perfect and that image. And I remember, even though we were in this Christian bubble and we weren't allowed to see a lot of watch certain movies and listen to certain music, we, being teenagers, would sneak in CDs and music and movies and secretly watch them, which we'd get in trouble for when we were found out.
Yeah, within that lifestyle, as we get into teenage years and stuff like that, of course, we're going to rebel in some ways or make decisions that we find aligns more closely with our view of things, and so we're going to experiment with marijuana or alcohol or whatever. Or we're gonna get into the same kind of music that our friends are into, that they introduce us to. I mean, I remember the first time hearing in any sort of like rock and roll, like Led Zeppelin or Pink Floyd or the Beatles, and just immediately being drawn to it. I liked it right away. And so as soon as I could have it, as soon as I could get, my friend would give me a cassette. That's dating myself, but a cassette or eventually a CD. I would wear those things out. I mean, absolutely. I would, at nighttime when I'd go to sleep, I'd have my little Walkman or whatever, and I'd be listening to whatever.
The first two secular, quote unquote, songs I remember listening to were "Smells Like Teen Spirit" and "Gangster's Paradise" by Coolio.
That encapsulates the early 90s right there, folks.
I feel like, though, it hit a certain point where our dad kind of started to get disillusioned again. He felt like the church wasn't doing well financially. People didn't want to help out. He felt like, he wanted to start a church so that people would get into outreach, helping other people. But most people wanted to sit there and feel better about themselves.
And that also greatly affected our father's health. I mean, during that time period, he was incredibly stressed because he was taking on so much responsibility. He had all these people that wanted him to be the person to fix them. He's got to have all the answers. And so there was a lot of weight on his shoulders to hold up the church and hold up that responsibility, to where it affected his health physically and mentally, I'm sure, to the point where he was having high blood pressure and having to go on heart medications. And you could see that it had, just like being president, it had aged him.
Also, just looking at his life, to him, it felt like it was a series of kind of failures and letdowns. All these organizations that didn't go anywhere in the end to him. And he felt like the same thing was happening with the church. And it was an interesting time for me. I know you're 4 years older than me, but I think it ended up falling apart when I was about 16. It was like toward the end of my high school experience, which is just an interesting time for it to kind of collapse. I remember it was like, the George Bush administration, the Iraq-Afghanistan war was happening. Just a kind of a crazy, tumultuous time. And then our dad deciding to pull the plug on the church and say, hey, we're going to shut this down and it's over. And what is my life now that I've spent my entire life basically in ministry and trying to preach God's word, and it's led nowhere. He felt like, God even was that he felt like God didn't even care as how he felt. And I know kind of created a rift between our dad and mom because, my mom was still part of religion and church and he was now leaving it.
So during the course of my parents having this church, I had just turned 18, and I had heard about an organization that was going to be doing things like feeding homeless people, and you could travel, you could go and do what's called a DTS, which was a discipleship training school through YWAM. YWAM, it stands for Youth with a Mission again, although some ironically call it Youth Without Any Money or Youth Who Are Manipulated. But I used my entire savings that I had that was set aside maybe for college or whatever, but it was around $5,000 to attend this 6-month school in Jamaica. I'm not going to go too into detail on this because it kind of, it sort of warrants its own podcast on its own, so I don't want to go into too much detail, but basically it was a 6-month intensive school. YWAM is also very evangelical. It's not denominational, but it's evangelical, and obviously a big emphasis on missionary work, going into all the nations and winning the world over for Jesus and all that stuff. So, but even after spending $5,000 to attend the school, I still ended up having to spend extra money on food because I wasn't really getting enough food. And even with me supplementing my meals with additional money, I still ended up losing weight. And overall, the experience there was far from positive. It was deeply manipulative and spiritually abusive. And so it was not a great experience. It took a lot of years of objectively analyzing my previously held beliefs. And I honestly found it challenging to reconcile them. So it began kind of a gradual journey of deconstruction, ultimately leading me to step away from those beliefs. And essentially that's where I am today.
It's interesting how we kind of have these, obviously our upbringing was kind of the shared experience, and we had kind of our own journeys in life of our own, making, but ultimately we've kind of come full circle to landing in the same place as one another. And I think that for me, there was a few events that happened. I remember when I was in high school age, or maybe towards the end of that, 17 or so, I remember getting on online message boards, and there was topics of religion, and I remember going on there to debate people that were more liberal and more agnostic and atheists. And I remember I kind of wanted to show them up at the time, or be like, you're wrong and here's why. And I was interested in that sort of the debating aspect of it. And I realized the more that I debated and the more that I expressed my views, seeing them back at me and seeing their responses, hearing them back, I sounded like kind of an idiot. And I didn't like what I was saying. I didn't like how I was hearing myself. And the things I was saying started to not make much sense to me. And I think I was obviously, I've always been a big cinephile and big movie person. I feel like movies really shaped my perspective heavily. And I feel like where religion was very dogmatic and controlling, I feel like movies were a way of introducing me to different worlds and different people and empathy and compassion, because movies put you in the shoes of other people, and that's the point of them. So movies kind of taught me a lot of things that religion and church was not teaching me. And I feel like I watched a few documentaries early on that really transformed my thinking, and almost overnight made me flip. They were so powerful, and it was kind of all culminating at the same time with, like I said, debating these people online and being in high school, seeing the protests against the war. A lot of the religious people that we grew up around were very supportive of the Iraq war and the Bush administration and all of those things going on. And I feel like it all started to crumble for me. It started to not make any sense to me. I started to question all of it. And just that thinking and sort of the God of war of the Old Testament. And I just thought, that it made more sense to be, the message of Jesus made a bit more sense of peace and love and being kind to each other and empathy. And I also felt like a big advocate for justice in the world. And so for me, none of that aligned anymore. And I think having friends that were outside the bubble a bit helped burst it a bit. And but ultimately, I think documentaries and films changed my viewpoint. And I will also say that it's hard to question your views on life and to question your thinking and ideologies and to transform and change them, because it's what you've been taught your whole life to suddenly just in one moment suddenly just take that and throw it away is hard to do. And it takes a long time to deconstruct, but that definitely started happening in my late teens. And I felt like I didn't want anything to do with religion anymore. I wanted to walk away from it. And it was around the time that our church was closing down and our own dad was walking away from it. So the timing was really interesting too. so for me, I just kept pursuing that and learning about and questioning things outside of religion. And it just eventually broke down. And I know we'll get into more of this in the next podcast, but that's kind of how I started to deconstruct.
I think when you are indoctrinated as a child, you, like I said before, you really start to see those beliefs as being ingrained with your very identity. So when you question those, it feels like you're questioning your own very identity. And you're also maybe worried or concerned about offending family members, or how are they going to see me if I no longer align with those beliefs.
There's definitely a lot of indoctrination and brainwashing that goes on. And I think it's bad when it could be any religion or any group. If you can't question them, if you can't question anything, that's not a good sign. And there are Christians out there who are more open to questioning things, and I think that's great. And but that's where the difficulty comes in some of the, especially evangelical circles. I feel like it's really about creating these kind of warriors for Jesus, and how that ties into Christian nationalism, which is a big issue, which we'll talk about further later on as well. But where it's about dominance and power and taking control, like the Crusades. And it's a very different approach from people who just generally and personally believe in something and aren't forcing it on anyone else and aren't pressuring them to believe it the same way. I believe that we should all have a choice. My one problem with the way we grew up is I feel like I didn't get a choice or a voice growing up. And I feel like that's part of the reason for this podcast is we're able to have a voice. And I feel like anyone can believe whatever they want to believe, and I can respect that. But what I don't respect is the dogma and the indoctrination, and really a lot of forms of and really there's a lot of things that are detrimental to people's upbringing. I think, again, in regards to growing up gay or whatever else it might be, that's very damaging and harmful.
Yeah, I think being careful about what we teach our kids from an early age, especially when they don't have critical thinking skills and they are just sort of forced to accept it, because it is that authoritarian or heavy-handed approach that can be so damaging later on. If I think about things like morality, I can still find ways of teaching. I have a son now. He's 2 years old, and I can find ways of teaching him about morality that are not dogmatic, about having empathy and compassion and things like that, and without the dogmatic approach. And I want him to kind of come to his own conclusions and have a choice in terms of what he wants to, where he wants to go with it.
I think that's healthy, and I think it's a great way to generally come about your beliefs instead of having them forced upon you. I think most people, that whatever religion they grew up in, that's the religion they believe in.
A lot of people's beliefs stem from two things: one, where they're born, and what religion their parents have.
Yeah, and I think it's understandable and it makes sense. I think giving your child the ability to come up with their own opinions on things when they're old enough and can actually comprehend what they are and actually understand on a deep level what they're getting into, that's completely different. Because I think the indoctrination at a young age is really detrimental, because you just don't have a way of questioning or understanding it or having differing viewpoints. So I think that giving your child the ability to make up their own mind is the most healthy, and also they're going to come about it naturally, and you're giving them the choice, and I think they can be whatever they want to be, right? You're allowing them to make their own decisions. I don't think you need religion. I think you need empathy. And you can have religion, that's fine, but I think you can have morality and empathy outside of religion. And that's something that a lot of Christians don't think you can have, which I completely disagree with. And I think it's one of the most important things you can have, because that's where kindness typically stems from, and people caring about other people and seeing other people's viewpoints from their point of view.
Right. The other thing I want to talk about is, real quick, is when you teach your child about a literal hell, that kind of teaching is considered a form of phobia indoctrination. So children are taught to fear eternal punishment for moral failings, for not adhering to specific religious beliefs. So phobia indoctrination is something that is used as a cult mind control tactic. It's a powerful technique if you want to keep people dependent and obedient, but that can lead to long-term trauma such as fear, anxiety, depression, those things. And if the intention is to guide children toward a moral behavior, then teaching morality through positive reinforcement, empathy, and understanding can lead to healthier emotional or psychological development, as opposed to the method of using fear, which can have unintended and damaging consequences.
Ultimately, we both came to the same conclusions for the most part, and we walked away from religion and have not looked back.
Yeah, and it's I'm in my 40s now. I'm 41, and I'm still unpacking a lot of the trauma, but I'm finding healthy ways to deal with that and to continue to heal. And it's an ongoing process. It's not something that you just do overnight. Obviously, the decision to walk away was not something that happened overnight. It was a gradual process of objectively questioning, what do I really believe? And it's a gradual process. But just even having the conversation is a great place to start.
I agree. For me, I'm 37 and I'm still unpacking as well. I think you never stop unpacking, but for me, the greatest way to deal with it all is through art, which is how I've always processed everything in my life. And I think whether through film, through writing and podcasts like this, speaking out, I think it's a great way to deal with it, and also to share a story and to connect with other people who have been through this as well, or are curious about this world and curious about people's experiences like ourselves.
I guess an ending quote that I want to leave with is by a Marcus Aurelius, and it goes like this: "Live a good life. If there are gods and they are just, then they will not care how devout you have been, but will welcome you based on the virtues you have lived by. If there are gods but unjust, then you should not want to worship them. If there are no gods, then you will be gone but will have lived a noble life that will live on in the memories of your loved ones." Okay, I think we'll leave it there. That wraps up today's episode. So thank you for listening.
We hope you tune in to our next podcast, where we'll dive into the challenges of taking the Bible literally and uncover some of the myths behind the miracles. Thanks for listening.
Bye-bye.